Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hi, Gertrude. Thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor to get to be on your show. My name is Beth McNamee. I'm based in Los Angeles, California, USA. Specifically, I'm in the West Hollywood neighborhood, which is it's a really lovely community within LA, and I've been living here for about 2 years, and I'll get into kind of how I ended up in LA and all of that as I tell my story. It's challenging sometimes to know where to start, because like any story we all have, there's different angles and ways into it. And I think for me, I'm in a moment of a lot of transition in my life. I just turned 40 about a week ago, November 26th. And so with any milestone birthday, there's always a lot of reflection on what's coming next. I've been in my role as a partner at Leaders Quest for 7 years now. And, I've been feeling a call to potentially think about, what's next for me, and, what I want to build on my own. So I'm really exploring just what this next decade of my life looks like. If I start like way back when, as a child, I was a very high performing child. And I think it's such a funny way to describe a child, because it's kids can just be, but I felt a lot of pressure from a young age to do really well in school, to be really good. And I succeeded in that. And, as a result, I got a lot of, affirmation and validation that I was doing a good job. And I became very reliant on that to feel okay and to feel safe in this world. And then I, became afraid of losing that validation and affirmation. And so, I went from being a very high performing child to a very stressed out child and eventually teenager. And, to cope with that, like, I was always looking for different ways to just escape and not, feel the pressure and stress of my own situation. And I share that background because, and I had so many lovely moments in my childhood and growing up. I'm very lucky to come from a place where, everything was taken care of, and I never had insecurity around, food, shelter, being looked after by adults, like things that some children unfortunately experience. But that early stress, like, has continued to shape who I am. And as I got into the working world, I, continued into this pattern of really um, feeling like I need to be performing to be okay and to be safe and all right in this world. And as a result, I have on numerous occasions really worked myself to the brink of not being well, mentally and physically. And so as I enter this stage of transition, I'm really looking at the questions of, how we work um, overall, as a society. What do we demand of people to be in their roles, and what have we all just tacitly agreed upon, to make the system we're in, keep working. And there's a really wonderful book called Rest is Resistance, that I've read this year, and really has opened my eyes just to that, the way we've all kind of agreed to maintain this way of grinding. And she talks a lot about a grind culture in the book. And so that's something that I've had with me my whole life. And then as an adult, it really started to play out in ways that were completely unsustainable. And, my story, I began my career abroad. I moved to South America, and I taught English. And from there, I took a role in Washington, D.C., where I helped professional and trade associations understand their members and, what those members need to be successful in their jobs. And professional associations in particular represent every profession you could ever imagine. And working in a research role, I got to do all kinds of surveys, focus groups, interviews, and I learned, that whatever industry people are in, I worked with everyone from DMV managers to neuroscientists. People want to feel sense of contribution in their jobs. They want to do a good job, and often what's in the way are structural barriers, lack of resources, burnout, and so it really opened my eyes to just how important work is to us as people, and how challenging it can be to thrive in a workplace. And from that job, I was, in my 20s, still pretty young. I wanted to do something bigger, more global. Though now I'm like, I don't, what could be. I think it is pretty big to look at the way people work. But to make a change, I went to business school. I from business school got an opportunity to move to South Korea. I lived in Seoul for 3 years working for Samsung, and that was also a huge period of transition in my life. And funny enough, it was just as I was turning 30. So I moved there a little over 10 years ago. And during that time, I was having a few kinds of unraveling. So the first was professional, because I had imagined that going to business school, getting this kind of big international job, was all that I had wanted for my career. And it was really exciting working towards it. But once I was there, I didn't feel any different. I didn't feel fulfilled. And so I think there was some kind of, untended to spiritual void that I thought that a career could fill, but it couldn't. There was a, second, just personal, my own concept of myself was disintegrating. And I had considered myself to be such an open-minded, globally minded, tolerant, accepting person. And, I thought it was a natural fit for working internationally. And today I would say I am a great fit. I don't know if it's a natural fit. It's a, hard earned fit. But living in Korea, like I just found everything so hard. And I had every privilege you could imagine, help getting an apartment. I had a very prestigious job. Samsung is a great company, and it's the biggest company in that country. And but I just struggled, the cultural differences, eating lunch at a specific time. Like for some reason, that was just so hard for me. And I think it was the accumulation of things that were much more regimented than I was used to, things that didn't make sense according to my way of seeing the world. And I felt so much stress, and I felt so crushed. I felt so much resistance to the way things are done. And, in my resisting of things, I missed out on a lot of good experiences I could have had. I mean, I did have many, many great experiences, but, I also just, what I got to learn because of that was like really how much I think my way of doing things is like correct or better. And, to start seeing yourself in that light, it doesn't feel great. You want to think that, or I wanted to think I'm, much more open-minded. And I had to look at, just how much doing things a different way than I was used to triggered me. And so, I was having this experience of kind of my way of seeing myself in the world being challenged by my circumstances, and me realizing I'm much more rigid than I had initially thought. I was working really, really hard. I was on a assignment that there was a hardworking culture. And I, at the same time, like began really struggling with anxiety in a significant way, and experiencing panic attacks and other things where my anxiety got to levels where it was so unmanageable. I'd feel physically like something was wrong with me. And so, during this time, I also began, I'm going to call it, I guess, my spiritual disintegration. But like learning about meditation, learning about spiritual practices and ways to like quiet myself and my mind in the world. And that's been invaluable, and something I've continued to expand and grow over the past 10 years. But I share that because, it was such a big period of learning and expansion, and, shedding old ideas. Yet, here at 40, I find myself at similar crossroads of looking at, where is my thinking so rigid that I'm holding myself back? Like, where am I pushing myself so hard that I'm harming my physical health? And that it's challenging, but I'm in this spot with a lot more tools than I had 10 years ago. A lot of passion for the topic, and desire to work on the ways of working and being in the world that really harm us individually and societally. And I'm also, we're in a different time where there's sort of a more widespread openness to this kind of conversation that I'm sharing through my story. And for me, what that looks like now is bringing to life like different practices that have helped me. So some things include mindfulness, somatic practices, learning about biases and unconscious ways of thinking in our own minds. And I've been really privileged in my role at Leaders Quest to get to do that with leaders and companies all around the world. And, then thinking about like, what is the role of an organization in improving the way that people are treated in society. And I think, Gertrude, you and I got connected through a friend, Sterling, who is an incredible diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, someone who's really doing this work in the world. And I met him through my current role. And one of the things is, creating these spaces where the old structural ways that have kept certain people out, that have made, work a place that, perpetuates some of the hardships that exist in society, to make them less real, and to work on consciously taking those out of our places of work. And so I feel funny. I talked about myself completely in the context of work, as I'm saying, being too obsessed with work has, been a challenge in my life. But I really feel that there is a higher calling I have around, how we get to express ourselves and make a living in the world. And I hope I can spend, more of my effort doing that. It really lights me up. And I do have lots of hobbies and other things I enjoy in my free time, and particularly being here in Los Angeles, getting outside. So for another episode, all the many wonderful things I do outside of work.
Oh, wow. Beth, just listening to your story, it's amazing how we all are not aware of our unconscious bias. We all have it in one way, shape, or form. How did it feel when you finally realized, where you were at and how you were being? And then how did you correct and rectify that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in my experience, the first step to recognizing it was feeling the acute pain of conflict. And I am someone who shares my opinion, sometimes for better or for worse. But, I would talk to my colleagues, be like, this shouldn't be like this. That's not right. That's not okay. And they just say, Beth, it's how it is. It's fine. It's not going to change. And I would fight things. And I really think that part of my burnout I experienced during that time was how much I was fighting. And so I couldn't gain that awareness except for the fact that I was suffering so much, not because of the culture, but because of my resistance to the culture. And because that felt so bad, I was able to look at, okay, what's actually going on here? And like, what am I, and my first reaction is feeling a little embarrassed, like I wanted to think I was more mature than that. But I think in rectifying it, there's, reminding myself not to dwell in the embarrassment, because that's just a way, it's kind of another form of resistance and not acting. And, I still have to work on that to this day. When I find out new things about myself, it's like, oh, you go back to being, the kid who took a cookie you weren't supposed to. And, it can be easy to feel bad about myself in those situations. But what I have found is a few things, like really learning about like why people approach the world the way they do, which one, it's fascinating. And, with the example of Korea, like I had the experience of, learning about how they rebuilt the country after the Korean War, and like what it's literally called the Miracle on the Han, but, how people had to work and, structure teams to be able to make that happen. And, you realize that way of getting things done has many merits and can be really impressive. And, I also had to kind of look at, well, what is my role? And, what is fit for me to evaluate and judge, and what is not. And I think for me, the ongoing thing is, there's a few things I can have really strong, passionate opinions about, and most other things, I don't need to, nor should I. I have an opinion on
Just let
everything.
go, right?
Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So tell me, in terms of your work now with different organizations, organizational transformation is always a challenge. So can you share your approach in helping companies and leaders transform their organizations in response to contemporary challenges?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is what you already mentioned are these biases, particularly unconscious biases. And a client recently introduced me to a group of participants in a leadership training program and said, Beth's going to talk about why we know what we should do, so like a lot of the time, but still don't do it. So that kind of bias of, why do we just default to the automatic is something I think every leader at every level in an organization needs to work on for an organization to transform. Because when we're behaving in just our automatic ways, we don't really fully connect as humans, and we don't see the opportunities for meaningful change to exist. The other practice that has been really helpful to my clients, and I work with a framework called the Three Horizons, and Leaders Quest has used this with a lot of clients, developed by a man named Bill Sharp. And it is really what is the question you're asking about the future? And then how do you really get all voices into the conversation to look at what patterns for the future could exist and kind of collectively agree what a future vision is. And that doesn't mean, okay, let's vote on which one is best, but there's a way of patterning something that has elements that really work for everyone. And it's a living practice, and there's a framework and way of doing things, but that visioning the future with stakeholders who often don't agree is essential, because if we all have completely separate visions, we're likely not to achieve them, or to really have to change in the way needed to create a different kind of world.
Yeah. When we first met, we talked a little bit about the race relations issues in the United States, especially after the George Floyd incident. In addressing racial inequality, how do you assist leaders in understanding and formulating responses to structural racial inequalities?
Yeah, it's so important, and I can talk a little bit about the work I did in 2020. I was working with the leadership team of an organization, and what that murder of George Floyd made them realize is that they had no idea what was going on in the United States. And the first thing they had to do was know what they don't know. And so really looking at what is the origin of this. And I think origin stories are so important. I talked about the post-Korean War growth, and in the United States, it all goes back to people being enslaved, kidnapped, brought over to this country, and then that evolving into our modern prison system. And so it starts with getting an education on that, meeting people who've been incarcerated, learning about people who've left traditional business. There's this woman, Carla Walker Miller, who a brilliant engineer, a Black woman who just couldn't get her space in the typical companies. And so she started her own utility business, and she runs it a totally different way. But understanding why would she leave and start something different? And
Yeah.
so the first step is really understanding like what the experience of other people is, how did the system like get to a place where that's people's experience, and then grappling with what can't you keep doing knowing what you know now.
Yes. Yeah, that's very important. And you also mentioned that you had traveled to South Africa and you learned a few things there in terms of how to handle race relations issues. I shared with you my experience with the Reconciliation Commission when apartheid ended, and the power of storytelling and just listening, learning to truly listen to the stories of those who are oppressed. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I went to South Africa in February of 2020 and did a training with an organization called Heartlines, and they have a process called What's Your Story? And it's really based on the reconciliation that took place in South Africa, where people who have been affected in their apartheid system, including people who perpetuated the apartheid system, share their personal stories of, what were they like, what was their experience like, and then, what changed, and what are they like now. And so one of the things we learned were tools for, being able to distill your story into key moments. And that's why I said, it's hard to know which angle of a story to go into, because all of our stories are, they're so multi-layered, and you could go in from one angle and hear a totally different experience than another angle. But we're looking for those key moments that really define, a path that you're on now. So some of it was just gaining tools for helping people to tell their
Yeah.
story in that way. And then we also focused on how do you listen so well that you can present someone's story in a way that honors it and feels good to that person. And it's not because we should all be going around and presenting each other's stories to the world. We should be telling our own. But that's the kind of depth of listening you aim for, that you could do justice to someone else's story and tell it with them in the room and have them feel heard and seen and appreciated. So that was another great tool I learned from them. And they were actually with clients and thinking about race relations in the US. I had them meet over Zoom, many of my clients, and have them tell their stories and tell the South Africa story, because it was a way to address the US story by looking, through another lens and another location.
Yeah, yeah, that really helps. So now, in terms of crisis management and trust building, can you describe your process for diagnosing and addressing the root causes in the wake of a culture crisis?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is, I think it mirrors a little bit the experience I had with coming to terms with my own rigidity, is you really need to help an organization see that the trouble they're in is not sustainable, and that the pain of addressing it is actually less than the pain that they will experience to continue operating the same way. And
Yeah.
I say that somewhat reluctantly, because I think people should solve, cultural challenges in organizations just because it's the right thing to do. But we all know change is really hard, and getting people in groups to choose to do things differently is really hard. And so I always start with a really vast process of listening to a lot of different people and creating safe and confidential spaces to do that, where people can really share what's going on, without someone in leadership or management listening in, and talk about it from both their personal experiences, what they hope for and dream of, where they've been let down, what they love about where they work. So it's listening to people from all parts of an organization, and not just saying what's wrong, but like also knowing, like, why are you here? People often join an organization because they love what it does. They love the product. So we try to create that whole picture, talking to management and leadership, understanding what they struggle with, because sometimes they're struggling with the same things as the employees, but in a different way. And if you can't address it there, it's going to be really hard to address across the organization. And, looking outside for complementary organizations to really help provide some insight into, none of these crises are particularly unique. They all feel unique when you're in them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's happening everywhere. So, in
Yeah.
terms of innovative leadership training, how do you train senior business leaders to be more innovative and responsive to disruption, particularly through systems thinking and experiential learning?
Yeah. So the three horizons process that I mentioned, and which I actually believe there's an open training coming up sometime soon, but that's a really great way to foster innovative thinking, because it's not just about coming up with a vision for the future, but it's about learning to distinguish between incremental and transformative change. And I think that, to me, being able to start saying this change is going to kind of make things a little bit better, but keep us in the same systemic challenge with a little less pain, or this change is going to move us out of that systemic challenge. And that's a muscle to build, both individually and collectively. And so it's a great framework for doing that.
That's wonderful. So, global collaboration at Samsung, what was your strategy in developing a process for global collaboration across Samsung's distributed HR teams?
I'm feeling a little like a broken record, because I'm like, the first thing I did is I went around the world and I listened to everyone, and what they needed, what was working well, and what was not working well. And I'm repeating it just because it's actually the first step, every time. And I'm a market researcher by training, but I really think you wouldn't go out into the world with a new product without researching the market. And internally, if you're trying to collaborate and develop something collaboratively in your organization, like, you can't go out successfully without first understanding that internal market. And some of the other things that were important were, like, a lot of internal collaboration is about informal roles. People have their full-time job and they're working often on these big collaborative projects because they care and they're passionate about it. And so how do you really understand what makes them feel special in those situations, and honors their contribution? And in this case, we were able to give this team an opportunity to travel and deliver the new program we developed internationally. And so it's a really hard project. It was on top of their day-to-day work, but they got to go and, to very different places than where they're from, and share the work. And so making sure those experiences bookend or even come, within a collaborative experience. So finding the ways to continuously just reward massive contributions people are making because they care.
I love that. Now, part of your work is CEO coaching. What key elements do you focus on when coaching a new CEO on setting their vision, strategy, and gaining organizational buy-in?
Yeah, and it's interesting, because with the CEO, they have a little bit more responsibility and remit for, making decisions, versus just, collaborating in creating that vision. I would say, the things I really focus on with CEOs are, one, the importance of language.
Yeah.
There's so many visions out there that are, watered down to the point of not really meaning anything, because there's, a desire to please so many different stakeholders. And so, how do you actually say something of substance and meaning, um, about where you're going in the world? I think the second thing with, and not just CEOs, but senior leaders, it's not just about listening to your employees. That's really important, but really understanding the broader global context that you're in. Where in the world is innovation happening? Where do you operate? That there's, like, what are the social challenges in the communities where you operate, and really starting to, in that vision, bake in, what is our impact on the world, and not just saying, oh, we're going to do good alongside of our mission, but if this is where we operate and how we operate, like, what do we have to aspire to be regenerative and not extractive in those locations.
I like that. So, change management expertise. In your experience, what are some effective change management strategies for today's evolving business landscape? Things are changing so much and so fast.
Yeah. Well, my first exposure to change management was working on a supply chain project when I was a strategy consultant. And what I learned is that the issues, sometimes there's just not enough stuff or ways to deliver, but many of the issues just came down to communication. And so with change management, I think really identifying the ways to communicate so people can hear a message. You can communicate a message sometimes 5, 6, 7 times, and people haven't registered it. And you see the frustration of, but I emailed it, like, why don't people know? And so there is this need for constant communications. I think
Yeah,
there's a need for processing emotion that also gets skipped over as change happens. People are inevitably losing something, even when it's positive change. And it can be easy to say, early in my career, I was leading the change of a market research system, and it was going to be a better system. And I just thought, great, we're going to have this better system. It's amazing. Everyone will love it. People didn't love it because they didn't know how to use it. They didn't know if they could trust it. It was hard. And I had to backtrack multiple steps and say, hey, here's why we would use this, and, like, really get people to understand that. Maybe one
yeah,
person can do a project with me on this. And so, like, how to, I think, bring people along and to acknowledge the emotion and the fear that comes with it, and not
mhm,
just sweep that under the rug.
yeah. It's easy to ignore. So, you do a lot of pro bono support for underrepresented founders. How do you select and advise these underrepresented founders and social entrepreneurs in their startup pitches?
So it is a very informal process at the moment. Mostly I've had people come through my network. So someone will know a founder with a specific challenge I could help with, and will send them my way. I let people know I really enjoy helping people get the salaries and compensations that they deserve if they're not a founder. So I share that with people going through, periods of their own change, and am happy to kind of have a conversation about that. So at the moment, it's manageable, just the volume coming in, because it is through that referral stage. And I include it on my LinkedIn. So if people don't know me, they can kind of see that. But yeah, that's how it goes so far.
In addressing systemic inequalities, what are some ways you believe businesses can lead in addressing systemic wealth and education inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge, I'll say, I think has to do with the nature of how companies are evaluated and receive financing. And so the shareholder model where, in publicly traded companies, shareholders, dictate decision making in many ways.
Yeah.
Is to me something collectively for us to address. I know no company alone can do that. One model that's been really interesting to watch and hopeful is the B Corp movement. So I think in thinking about founders, like what kind of company do you start? Like what is the actual structure of it? There are different models out there besides just getting funding and going public, and so that's something I think interesting for earlier stage entrepreneurs to find out. And I think with the wealth gap, we're seeing record CEO pay, in many industries, while worker benefits and compensation are decreasing. And I live in LA. We had months of strikes here with the writers and actors guilds, advocating to be fairly compensated and represented in their industries. That's happened in the auto industry. So I think there's something to the people who work in jobs are starting to advocate for themselves more. But I think employers need to look at, what the spread of compensation is. And I don't think it's one many employers are going to want to look at in the near term. And so there are companies out there that have more equitable models, that have, no one below a living wage. And, my hope is those kinds of companies to gain power and influence and, to help turn the tide. But I definitely think, first starting with how do you compensate? Who do you give benefits to? How do you work with labor movements? Is really important. It's like starting in your own home, because that's where you can have the most immediate impact. And yeah.
That's so true. Now, my last question for you is around story and comedy as a tool for change. How do you utilize story and comedy as a tool for change in your work with businesses and leaders?
Yeah. So I mean, we've talked a little bit about story and just in the racial equity piece of the work, but stories are how we learn and retain information. So there is an element of connecting people with stories that help them see different issues in a human way. And I personally love comedy. I very briefly did some stand-up comedy in my life, very amateurly. But to me, there's so many comedians out there who, some are, silly, some are offensive, but there are others who are shedding really great light onto important messages. So, one that comes to mind, there's a comedian, Hannah Gatsby, who, talks about belonging, identity, and discrimination, and, different issues in a comedy show. And so there's lots of examples of actually mass media content out there where
Yes.
an issue can be made accessible to a wider population. And I think there's something so powerful to that. And so I've only personally, explored the tip of the iceberg, but there's just a lot of power in the content people consume and how it can really open people's minds.
And comedy also softens the blow sometimes. When you lighten things up with humor, you can discuss very serious issues infused with comedy. Yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Beth, it has been an absolute honor interviewing you and talking to you today. Thank you for coming online and gracing us with your story and your knowledge. I have your website scrolling at the bottom of the screen if anybody wants to contact you. Thank you so much for showing up this morning.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. And I hope we have more conversations informally or otherwise in the future.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is bringing us voices from all over the world, sharing knowledge, skills, stories, and tools on how to manage diversity in the workplace and beyond. So come back again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And bye for now. Thanks again, Beth. And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open,